What is the motivation of the others/White Walkers? It appears that George R. R. Martin has kept their motivations as well as their origin a complete mystery. But if you look closely, there is an explanation. Disguised as a mere anecdote from the past and a child's bedtime story told by Old Nan, we learn the desire of the White Walkers. Old Nan tells Bran Stark the story of the Night's King, perhaps as a cautionary tale about falling in love with the wrong woman, or the dangers of the far north, but nonetheless it ends up being something much more significant and revealing to the root of our story overall. Now the adults and the maesters shrug off Old Nan's tales as mere folklore and fantasy, but there has been noted evidence of some truth in her stories of giants and such. The story of the Night's King is particularly of interest because it is a mirror reflection of Jon Snow's position when he becomes the 99th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Just as this Night's King was the 13th Commander of the Night's Watch. Also of great note is that this commander was rumored to be a Stark, possibly even named Brandon, perhaps in association with the famous ancient Stark, Brandon the Builder, the same man who was credited with creating the Wall and Storm's End with the aid of magic. The story of the Night's King tells us that this 13th Lord Commander met a woman unlike any. Now, because of the loose nature of this story and sketchy record of events, we have very few details as to where exactly she came from, her age, her name, etc. But Old Nan tells that she has had skin as white as the moon and eyes like blue stars, and likewise her skin was cold as ice. After he fell in love with her, they moved to the Night Fort along the wall, and he declared himself king and her his queen. It is said that when they made love, she took his very soul from him. With strange sorceries, he bound the Night's Watch members to succumb to his demand. It has been said by historians that during his 13-year reign, he committed many atrocities, although he was eventually disposed of, presumably killed, by the forces led by the Lord of Winterfell and Joramun, the king beyond the wall. It was discovered by the people that the Night's King had been sacrificing children to others. The purpose of this, however, remained a mystery. Now, having gathered all this lengthy info, it would be pretty safe to assume that George R. R. Martin wrote this part of the story for a good reason. Certainly more than just a world-building exercise, for there are far too many clues and references that link to the others for anyone to simply dismiss this as yet another wild folk tale in a world filled with outlandish folklore. An astute reader should gather from this story that, number one, the Corpse Queen had an intentionally strong influence on the Night's King. And number two, the Corpse Queen was deeply associated with the others. And number three, the child sacrifices to the others were important to them. Also noteworthy is the fact that it was never mentioned that despite being intimate with each other, the couple never had children. This should lead to believe that either she was incapable herself or that the pairing was incompatible, which would provide a reason why the child sacrifices were necessary. By taking into account what we know about the White Walker leader in the TV show, we see that just by a touch of the finger, a human child can become a White Walker. So therefore, we could safely assume that the intention of the Corpse Queen, and by extension the White Walkers, was to populate their species. Which begs the question, why would their species rely on this method of reproduction? This brings about the forming of several different theories, such as, number one, they are a small group of invasive species, perhaps from another planet. Or, number two, they suffered a catastrophe. Could it be their defeat during the original Long Night? And that led to the deaths of many of their kind, maybe even causing infertility. Now granted, the HBO show has chosen to go its own route in terms of lore and background origins, but there are probably some very close similarities. From the show, we saw the creation of the White Walkers by means of a human being transformed by the insertion of dragonglass into his body. What we know of dragonglass is that it is a natural element of the planet found deep in the ground as a result of volcanic activity, and by judging from the books, the very same volcanic activity that dragons originally spawned from. The show makes a point of showing that this dragon glass that created the first White Walker is also the only known weakness of their kind, as Valyrian steel is essentially created from the same fire source. Getting back to the idea that perhaps the White Walkers are infertile, they would need to continue assimilating humans into their own species on a consistent basis to maintain or increase their numbers. What further expedites the situation is that their supply of children has been cut off recently, when Craster and his female offspring were expunged. So now that makes them rather desperate and looking for replacements. Following this line of thought, we can see why the White Walkers need to go beyond the wall. However, what we don't know is how far they are willing to go. We know that they certainly aren't attached to killing humans en masse, but are they planning on wiping out the entirety of humanity? Or would they be accepting of a compromise? Would they agree to a treaty that would somehow result in them being able to populate their species? Could it be that they are not so much different from, say, a hive of bees and just need a fertile queen? Could it be that the merely assimilating a female child would not result in a White Walker capable of birthing their species? After all, marriages play a very important role in Westeros, and the fact that the survival of a house depends on new children being born and given dominion. It's a very strong theme throughout all of the Song of Ice and Fire series. It seems as though the only solution to avoiding the entire replacement of humanity by the White Walkers is to provide them with a fertile woman and allow them to reproduce. But who in our story would be willing to pay such a high price? To make the ultimate sacrifice? To give up part of their humanity and become a mother to another species in order to save them from extinction, and thus her own race as well. All of this in addition to the thought of becoming the consort to a White Walker with icy skin and frosted breath. Who would dare? But perhaps the burden shouldn't fall on just one person alone. Perhaps it would take two to form a union, a wedding of ice and fire. The warm blood of a human and the cold ichor of someone who has already experienced death. Together, they could herald a new hybrid civilization immune to the hazards of winter and the effects of aging. That could be a wonderful melody for a story of life and death, birth and rebirth, love and hate, peace through compromise, and war. A song of ice and fire.